Hi, my name is Lynn and I'm studying to become a B.C.B.A. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about BH5043, unit number 6, which is titled Introduction to Experimental Design. I find the title to be a little misleading because it doesn't go quite into all the designs first, but it introduces you to concepts that you need to be aware of before you start designing your experiments. That being said, it starts off with telling us about the reason why we're even able to have experimental design in the first place. So of course there are elements to an experiment, right? So we have independent variables and dependent variables, which we covered in previous units already. So we already have a basic understanding of those. But it also brings up the fact that we have a basic idea of extrinsic variability, which assumes that any variability in behavior is not necessarily intrinsic to the person or the behavior, right? So usually there are elements within the environment that create variability of behavior from the person we're studying. That being said, it discusses how we have experimental control, which is when systematic changes in an environment can reliably and predictably show results in behavior change. That is to say, you can clearly show that there's a connection between the independent variable and the dependent variable. From there, the unit moves on to validity. So whenever you do an experiment, you want it to be valid. But there are two types of validity it discusses. The first type being external validity, which is basically saying what is the extent that the results of your study can be put into other environments, with other demographics, with the other behaviors. So that's extrinsic validity. So just think, or external validity. So that's how far can it go outside of its original study. And internal validity is the extent to which the measured change of the dependent variable are due specifically to the changes of the independent variable. So how valid is the actual manipulation as far as like when you change the independent variable, how reliably does the dependent variable change with it? So of course, between the two validities, you really want internal validity. Of course, external validity matters, but the more important thing is how valid is your overall test, right? So you want to make sure that you can reliably show that there is actually a connection between the independent and dependent variables. So that's internal validity, and that will always take priority. From there, the unit discusses 8 threats to internal validity, all of which are really interesting, so I'll get into them. The first one they cover is history. So that is to say, for instance, if you tell a kid to touch their nose, but their nose is already itchy. So something happened before that's going to cause them to behave in such a way that you're expecting or you're hoping for. So history can be a direct threat to your internal validity because you're not entirely sure if there's something that happened before, directly before, that would cause them to perform in a way you'd want them to, right? The second threat they discuss is maturation. So maturation effects, especially within the field of ASD treatment through ABA, is kind of a big deal because we tend to, because of early intervention, deal with children who are in crucial stages of development. Maturation is basically a threat of internal validity because when a kid grows, they kind of naturally start gaining certain abilities in order to perform better, easier, faster. So that being said, sometimes there are maturation effects. If you have an ongoing goal that keeps going for like a year or two, and it's only within the past like year that you see a huge increase in independent correct responses, it may be due to maturation, because it may be to a point where they've actually finally got it, so to speak, because they were old enough to understand it or get it or actually perform correctly. So that's another threat of maturation, so that you have to consider that. The third threat that they discuss is testing, which is basically practice. So if you're showing a kid over and over the same SD or the same question over time with certain practices, it may seem like, oh no, that's just them learning it, right? Not necessarily. It could just be a form of practice. If you present a baseline too many times and they start realizing that you're not really responding to what they're saying, because in baseline or probing, you aren't supposed to react to their response, be it right or wrong, they may learn just like, okay, if I just point at anything, then it just moves things on. So that's an effect of testing or practice where they've been shown how the system works, so to speak. So they're going to start they learned the wrong rule, so to speak, and so they're starting to just do what they think needs to be done rather than actually paying attention to what's being presented to them. So that's another threat to internal validity. The fourth one is instrumentation. So is the change in your data due to actual things happening, or is it due to a change per se in how you took the data? This one usually comes from inconsistencies in how you take data. So for instance, if you're taking rate data and then you decide to change to duration, that's going to be a huge shift in what you're doing, right? And that may also present a huge shift in your data overall, but that's a change because you changed how you measured it, right? So that's another threat that you have to consider. So you have to make sure that when you choose your design, that you're consistent with how your basic instrumentation. The fifth one is diffusion of treatment. This threat is really interesting because basically what it's saying is, let's say you decide to run a program with a kid behaviorally, right? You're trying to get them to reduce tantrums, but then at the same time, the parents don't really tell you that they decided to give this kid a new vitamin intake. So suddenly there's a new variable that you haven't really anticipated, and they're suddenly like, oh, another thing is that like we started having him see like a therapist once a week for this. Suddenly there's a lot of different treatments going in, and you can't actually control which one is actually changing it. That's a diffusion of treatment. It's the change may occur from any combination or any single item, and you can't actually validly prove that your independent variable that you are manipulating changed the dependent variable. Number 6, as far as the list of threats, number 6 is regression towards mean. This one is really interesting because I feel like this happens quite often with a lot of people. Everyone I know has experienced this. Regression to mean just means that your baseline data or your probing data was not actually reflective of the child's ability or the subject's ability. So you took 3 to 5 probes, cold probes, or baseline data, but the kid was sick that day. And then when you start implementing this treatment, they start like outperforming the baseline almost immediately. And you're like, wait, what's going on here? Well, they're regressing to their average. They're actually going back to normal rather than just, oh, that was the normal sample. That was actually an abnormal sample that you took initially, and so it's going to regress to the mean. Number 7 is selection bias, and this is, I feel like in every field, but you may choose your sample size, so to speak, based off of the ability that you observe. So you're like, oh, this kid's super ready to learn this. This kid is not ready to learn this. So you're going to start kind of cutting down where you think there's going to be the most success, but naturally that's going to then bias your sample. So you have to be aware that when you choose to do something for a particular skill, that you choose kids at a similar level, but have, you have the right steps in order so that you're not making it biased towards your particular treatment because you want your treatment to work, right? So that could also be an effect of maturation, where a kid is about to learn something and you see they're starting to show signs that they can get it. You're now kind of piling on threats where you're putting on like selection bias and possibly maturity. So you have to just be aware of those. The last threat that they discuss is attrition. And this is a very simple one because it's a scientific field, which is you lose your test subjects. Basically, there's a loss of there's loss of funding, there's a loss of your test subjects, there's a loss of your testers, the people who can implement this. So you have to keep retraining and retraining. It just wears it over time, right? It slowly takes apart your overall experimentation. So those are the 8 basic threats that they discuss, and all of them, I've seen most of those happen for sure. Attrition, a little bit, probably the least out of all of them, but I've definitely seen all these things occur over time. From there, they go into the types of things that can affect your experimentation, namely confounding variables and extraneous variables. So extraneous variables are non-related events that can occur that can directly influence your data. So that would be like if you're working with a kid, then suddenly their parents decide to divorce and they don't tell you. Suddenly the kid is acting really weird because there's things that are completely unrelated to what you're doing that are influencing the behavior of the child. The confounding variables, on the other hand, are uncontrolled, kind of known variables that can influence the dependent variables. So let's say you have a kid who's like on a medication and you're running this experimentation with them, but then side effects of the medication start to occur. That may feel like an extraneous element. However, in your design, you already incorporated the fact that the medication was there. So you're already planning for that. But then the confounding variable is suddenly over time, the kid developed resistance to the medication or a side effect to the medication. So then you have to cut into it and say like, okay, despite the fact that the medication was consistently put here, this is going to be a confounding change because it was already implied. That's kind of what I got from it. When I did the unit test, they didn't really ask between the differences between extraneous and confounding, but you do have to be somewhat aware of the differences between them. A lot of people in different parts of the community actually conflate the two. They'll mix them together, whereas others use them separately. It's a little frustrating to see that our field has not yet agreed completely on what to use them with, like how to use them specifically, but it is something that should be considered. From there, the unit goes into 3 types of effects that can actually also threaten your internal validity, which are sequence effects, carryover effects, and multiple treatment effects. Sequence effects are basically when you're putting different treatments in a particular order. If you do them too consistently, you may see a sequence, right, of behavior that occurs, and it's almost like cyclical and it will follow it. That may sound like it's like, oh, that means that the independent variable and the dependent variable are like really influencing, but in reality it may just be the kid is expecting certain times, right? So they're kind of beating what's happening to them before it actually occurs. Carryover effects are basically if, let's say, a kid is tantruming and then you bring forth your treatment and the kid starts to or continues to tantrum during that treatment. That's a carryover effect because the kid was already angry, so to speak, right, beforehand, and was already kicking and screaming and crying. And then when you presented the treatment, they continue to kick, scream, or cry, right? So that's not necessarily a sequence thing. That's a carryover. It's carried over from whatever caused the tantrum to begin with. So that's a carryover effect. The multiple treatment effect is basically if you have multiple ideas, so if you have multiple treatments that you're trying to put in place, the treatments may start affecting each other via, be it retroactively or not, but the kid might start to kind of behave one way during one treatment, behave another way in another treatment. It kind of goes hand in hand with sequence effects, but even this occurs even when you randomize it. So they go into further depth into them in the unit. So I suggest when you take it to just make sure you pay attention to those. And then from there, they discuss cyclical responding. So cyclical responding is basically following like when a female has their time of the month. There may be a change in behavior during that time. When a child has to take a nap during a certain time of day, and so they get cranky, so to speak, before that time of day, right? So these are cyclical things that occur that follow a time pattern, and they're not really things that you can work out of, right? You have to incorporate them into your testing because it's not something you can remove from them. It's cyclical occurrences, so you have to make sure that you, when you're testing, you take those into account. From there, they discuss what is research. So research is the systematic manipulation used to answer questions that we have about the natural world. And practice is the systematic manipulation used to evaluate the effects of a treatment. So we have ABA research and ABA practice. So that's the differences between those two. They go into further nitty-gritty and details with those further into the unit. From there, they also discuss the 4 types of analysis questions, which are basically questions about how are you analyzing something? How are you doing something? What are we looking at here? What exactly are we thinking about? So that would be demonstrative questions, parametric questions, component questions, and comparative. So demonstrative is what are you demonstrating? What is being shown? Should we look into this? Parametric is what measurement are you using, right? Is it the correct measurement? Should you be using duration instead of rate, right? Component is basically, are you using the correct pieces that you need in order to do this, right? So if even let's say like, are you working on this at school or at home? Should you be working on this at home or at school or wherever, right? So that's a component. Environment's a component, right? And the last one is comparative, which is what are you comparing? Are you comparing the correct things that should be compared to, right? So those are the analysis questions they go over. From there are 2 categories of experimental design. Lo and behold, here's the intro, right? So the first is group, where you have a large group of people. You tend to have a control group or an intervention group. So there's a control and an intervention group, right? And you compare the inferential statistics used between them to show a difference. And then there is single case design. So that's when you study a single subject, and that subject has a baseline set of data and then an after treatment data. So they serve as their own baseline versus in the group study design, you are comparing 2 groups together. In a single case design, you're comparing the person's behavior or attribute before and after something, and that is specific to that particular person. All that is to say is for behavior, because it is so subjective towards a person, right? So one person's behavior is not going to exactly be the same as another person's behavior. In ABA, we always go after single case design. Group designs are used basically for psychological ideas. So when they're trying to look up like social psychology theories, or pharmaceutical is another good one, where they have like, you know, a placebo group and then an experimental group. Those are all group designs. So both types of designs definitely have their place in the worlds, but within ABA, we almost exclusively use single case designs. That becomes a little bit of an issue later on when it comes to publications of our research, but we'll get into that when we reach that particular unit. But from there, the unit ends on the introduction of the two phases of a single case design, which is the baseline and intervention. So with baseline and intervention, there are different ways you can design your experiment. You can use a reversal design, also known as a withdrawal design, or you can use ABA design. I know that's really confusing because it sounds like I'm just saying ABA, but basically what they're saying is component 1, component 2, and then back to component 1 design is what they're saying. So let's say there's baseline, and then there's treatment, and then you go back to baseline. So you're trying to compare if there's differences as you go on. They go further into that in Unit 7, but let me finish off the rest of this particular one of Unit 6. All that is to say is that in single case design, the most basic design we have is withdrawal design. Once again, that's also known as reversal design. They use them interchangeably, and they are used in different corners of our field. But basically, it's all that's understood of it is you always start with baseline. So you'd have no treatment, and then you have your intervention, and then that's with treatment. And usually you go back to baseline to see if that change, if there is any change, is directly caused from your intervention. So the only way to do that is to switch back and forth between the two sections of your design. That is something you need to be considerate of when you're thinking of selection bias, carryover effects, sequence effects, right? Because if you're going to do something consistently like that, that's where we see things like sequence effects occur. But once again, we'll get over that. We'll talk over that in the next particular unit, but Unit 6 wanted to end with introducing the idea of the most basic experimental design. So I hope that explains Unit 6 pretty well. It was a weird unit because it goes over conceptual things of experimentation, and then it goes over how to kind of try and deal with them, and then starts diving into actual experimentation design. And I found this particular unit to be fairly easy, in my opinion, because every one of the threats that they tested on were very clear, in my opinion. You know, like if it's maturation versus like diffusion of treatment. The harder ones were when it was an extraneous event versus a confounding event. There was like 1 or 2 questions about that I remember my cohorts actually kind of struggled with, because they're very, very similar. So just be aware of those differences. If you have any questions about it, just leave them in the comments below. If you have any corrections about this, because I did take this particular class way long ago, then also let me know, and I'll put in an addendum for this. But beyond that, I hope that I was able to clarify this unit pretty well, and I'll see you in the next video.